Europe's strongest economy is quietly drowning, and nobody wants to admit it. While the world watches America's drama and China's rise, something far more catastrophic is happening in the heart of Europe. Germany, the economic powerhouse that has anchored European stability for decades, is experiencing what can only be described as controlled demolition. But here's what the financial press won't tell you. This isn't happening by accident. Let me start with a number that should terrify every European. Germany's industrial production has fallen by 11.6% in the past 18 months. That's not a statistical blip, that's economic collapse in slow motion. When German factories shut down, when BMW moves production to Mexico, when BASF relocates chemical plants to China, we're not witnessing market adjustments, we're watching the systematic dismantling of European industrial capacity, and it's accelerating. The energy crisis that began with the Ukraine war has become something far more permanent. Russian gas, which powered German industry for decades, is gone, permanently. The pipelines that delivered cheap energy to European factories have been severed, not just physically, but politically. What replaced that energy? Nothing adequate. Renewable energy, despite decades of investment, cannot power heavy industry at competitive costs. Liquefied natural gas from America costs 3 times more than Russian pipeline gas. Green hydrogen remains experimental and expensive. German steel production has dropped 35% since 2021. Aluminium smelting has virtually disappeared. Chemical production, the foundation of German manufacturing excellence, is moving to countries with cheaper energy. This is deindustrialization in real time. But here's where it gets truly alarming. German corporate executives aren't planning to rebuild domestically, they're planning their escape. Volkswagen announced its first factory closure in Germany in the company's 87-year history. Not restructuring, closure. BMW is redirecting investment from German plants to facilities in Mexico and China. Mercedes-Benz is following the same script. These aren't temporary adjustments. These are permanent relocations of productive capacity. The German government, meanwhile, is trapped in ideological paralysis. The Green Party, part of the governing coalition, celebrates the closure of nuclear power plants while industrial competitiveness evaporates. They've turned energy policy into environmental theater while the economy burns. Nuclear plants that could have provided reliable, carbon-free power were shuttered precisely when Germany needed them most. The last 3 reactors were decommissioned in April 2023 at the height of the energy crisis. This is policy-induced suicide. But the energy crisis is only the beginning. Germany faces a demographic catastrophe that makes every other economic challenge worse. The German birth rate has been below replacement level for 50 years. The population is aging faster than any major economy except Japan. The workforce is shrinking precisely when the country needs maximum productivity to compete with Asia. Social security costs are exploding. Healthcare spending is consuming an ever larger share of GDP. The tax burden on working-age Germans has reached levels that discourage work, investment and entrepreneurship. Young Germans, watching their economic prospects diminish, are leaving. Net migration of educated Germans to other countries is at its highest level since reunification. Brain drain combined with industrial flight creates a downward spiral. Who remains? An aging population dependent on social transfers funded by a shrinking base of productive workers. Now, let me connect this to the broader European crisis, because Germany's collapse doesn't happen in isolation. The European Union's response to multiple crises has been to centralize control while individual member economies weaken. Brussels imposes regulations that increase costs while global competitors operate under different rules. European companies face carbon taxes, labor regulations, and compliance costs that their Asian competitors avoid. The result is predictable. Production moves to countries with lower costs and fewer restrictions. The European Central Bank, meanwhile, faces an impossible choice. Raise interest rates to combat inflation and you accelerate economic contraction. Keep rates low and you risk currency debasement while inflation erodes purchasing power. Europe is trapped in a vice of its own making. But here's what makes Germany's situation uniquely dangerous. Germany has been Europe's economic anchor for 30 years. German exports funded trade surpluses that allowed other European countries to run deficits. German industrial strength provided the tax revenue that funded EU transfers to poorer regions. When Germany weakens, the entire European project becomes unsustainable. Italian debt, already at 150% of GDP, becomes impossible to service without German backing. Spanish unemployment, chronically high, gets worse without German demand for Spanish goods. French social programs become unaffordable without German productivity supporting European growth. The Eurozone, designed around German strength, cannot function with German weakness. And the political consequences are already visible. Alternative for Deutschland, the far-right party, has become the strongest political force in Eastern German states. Voters facing economic decline are turning to radical alternatives. The same pattern appears across Europe. Economic stagnation fuels political extremism. The center cannot hold when the economic foundation crumbles. But let me tell you what's really happening behind the scenes in the corporate boardrooms and government ministries, where the real decisions get made. German industrial leaders are quietly relocating, not just production, but research and development. The intellectual capital that has driven German technological leadership is being moved to countries with better long-term prospects. Patent applications from German companies are declining. Investment in German research facilities is falling. The next generation of German industrial innovation is being developed elsewhere. This is how industrial leadership dies, not through dramatic collapse, but through gradual erosion of competitive advantage. Meanwhile, Chinese companies are acquiring German technology firms at record rates. What they can't buy, they're replicating through partnerships, joint ventures, and industrial espionage. Germany is financing its own technological obsolescence by selling its most advanced companies to strategic competitors. The banking sector tells the same story. Deutsche Bank, once Europe's most powerful financial institution, has been struggling for years. Its market capitalization is smaller than many regional American banks. German savings banks, the backbone of small business lending, are being squeezed by negative interest rates and increasing regulations. Without a strong financial sector, German companies cannot easily access capital for expansion and innovation. They become dependent on foreign banks or foreign investors, further eroding German economic sovereignty. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of Germany's decline is how it's being managed by the political establishment. Rather than acknowledging the severity of the crisis, German politicians engage in wishful thinking and blame external factors. The Russian invasion of Ukraine provided a convenient scapegoat for problems that began long before February 2022. German deindustrialization started with a decision to phase out nuclear power in 2011, accelerated with renewable energy mandates that ignored economic reality, and was completed by energy policies that prioritized symbolism over substance. Chancellor Olaf Scholz speaks of Zeitenwende, a historic turning point, but proposes no fundamental changes to the policies causing German decline. The Social Democrats remain committed to climate targets that require further industrial reductions. The Greens celebrate factory closures as environmental victories. Opposition parties offer no realistic alternatives. The Christian Democrats created many of these problems during Angela Merkel's 16-year chancellorship. The far-right Alternative for Germany provides angry rhetoric but no coherent economic program. German voters face a choice between different varieties of managed decline. The European Union, meanwhile, compounds Germany's problems through regulations that increase costs, while competitors operate under different rules. The EU's carbon border adjustments will theoretically level the playing field, but only if other major economies adopt similar measures. If they don't, European producers simply become less competitive. Brussels bureaucrats, insulated from economic reality, continue proposing new regulations that sound progressive but destroy industrial competitiveness. The latest corporate due diligence requirements will force German companies to police their entire supply chains, while Chinese competitors face no similar obligations. This regulatory asymmetry makes European business systematically less efficient than Asian alternatives. German engineering excellence cannot overcome structural cost disadvantages imposed by political choices. This winter will be the test. Energy costs remain elevated. Inflation is eroding consumer purchasing power. Industrial competitiveness continues declining. German households are already reducing consumption. Retail sales fell 4.7% in the third quarter compared to the previous year. Car sales dropped 31% in October. Consumer confidence is at levels associated with severe recessions. But the numbers only tell part of the story. Walk through any German industrial region and you'll see the human cost of deindustrialization. Factories that employed thousands now operate skeleton crews or stand empty entirely. In the Ruhr Valley, Once the heart of German steel production, unemployment has reached levels not seen since the early 1990s. Workers with decades of experience find themselves obsolete as entire industries relocate to Asia and North America. The ripple effects are devastating. When a major industrial plant closes, it doesn't just eliminate direct employment. The suppliers, service providers, and local businesses that depend on industrial wages collapse in sequence. Small German towns built around single large employers face existential threats. Without the tax revenue from major factories, local governments cannot maintain infrastructure, schools, or social services. Young people leave for cities or other countries, accelerating demographic decline. This is how industrial societies die. Not through dramatic collapse, but through gradual hollowing out of productive capacity. Meanwhile, German energy companies are struggling with debts accumulated during the transition to renewable power. The forced closure of nuclear plants left massive stranded assets, billions invested in infrastructure that was abandoned for political rather than economic reasons. EWE, one of Germany's largest utilities, reported losses of 3.2 billion euros in 2023. E.ON faces similar financial pressures. These companies, which should be leading Germany's energy transition, are instead burdened by the costs of premature nuclear decommissioning and unreliable renewable infrastructure. The energy grid itself is becoming unstable. Wind and solar power produce electricity intermittently, requiring massive investments in storage and backup systems that don't yet exist at scale. German consumers pay some of the highest electricity prices in the world, while reliability decreases. Industrial customers, who require reliable power for manufacturing processes, are increasingly looking elsewhere. Aluminum smelting, which requires consistent electrical supply, has essentially disappeared from Germany. Other energy-intensive industries are following the same path, but unlike previous recessions, this one is structural. The cheap energy that powered German prosperity is gone. The demographic dividend has turned into a demographic burden. The technological leadership that drove exports is being relocated to competitors. Recovery requires addressing these structural problems, but Germany's political system seems incapable of the necessary changes. Energy policy is constrained by environmental ideology that prioritizes symbolism over effectiveness. Immigration policy cannot address demographic decline when integration fails and social tensions rise. Economic policy is limited by EU regulations that prevent competitive responses to Asian challenges. Germany needs nuclear power to provide reliable energy for industry. But nuclear is politically impossible. Germany needs higher birth rates or massive skilled immigration to address demographic decline. But family policy has failed, and immigration creates political backlash. Germany needs regulatory flexibility to compete with Asia, but EU membership prevents policy independence. These aren't technical problems with technical solutions. These are political problems requiring political choices that the current system cannot make. The result is managed decline, gradual reduction in living standards as economic competitiveness erodes, slow transfer of industrial capacity to countries with better policies, steady erosion of Germany's position in global markets. This is what economic death looks like in the modern world. Not sudden collapse, but gradual irrelevance. And it's happening while European leaders focus on symbolic politics rather than economic fundamentals. Climate change targets, diversity initiatives, regulatory harmonization, all important in their own way, but irrelevant if the economic foundation collapses. The real tragedy is that this was avoidable. Germany had choices. Keep nuclear plants running, develop realistic energy alternatives before abandoning reliable sources, reform labor markets to increase productivity, encourage immigration of skilled workers while managing integration better. These choices weren't made. Instead, ideology trumped economics. Symbolism mattered more than substance. Political correctness became more important than economic competitiveness. Now the window for easy solutions has closed. Energy infrastructure that took decades to build has been dismantled. Industrial capacity that required generations to develop has been relocated. Technological leadership that was centuries in the making is being transferred to competitors. Rebuilding will be far more expensive and difficult than maintaining what existed. The human cost of these policy failures is already becoming visible. German birth rates, already below replacement level, are declining further as economic prospects dim. Young Germans increasingly see their future in other countries with better opportunities. The German pension system faces insolvency as the ratio of workers to retirees deteriorates. Healthcare costs explode as an aging population requires more medical care funded by fewer productive workers. Social cohesion frays as economic stress increases competition for shrinking resources. Immigration, theoretically a solution to demographic decline, has created new problems. Integration failures, cultural tensions, and political backlash against large-scale migration have made this policy option politically toxic. German cities struggle with housing shortages, school overcrowding, and social service pressures, while industrial regions face population decline and infrastructure decay. The country is simultaneously experiencing growth pressures and decline symptoms in different locations. Regional inequality is accelerating. Munich and Frankfurt remain relatively prosperous as financial and service centers, while former industrial regions in eastern Germany face economic devastation comparable to post-communist transition periods. This geographic polarization has political consequences. Eastern German states are increasingly dominated by parties that reject the consensus policies causing economic decline. Alternative for Deutschland and the new left-wing Sarah Wagenknecht alliance gain support by promising to restore German sovereignty and industrial strength. The political center, represented by traditional parties, offers only continued managed decline with better public relations. Voters facing economic hardship find these promises increasingly inadequate. But here's what should alarm you most. Germany's collapse is accelerating precisely when global tensions are rising, when economic strength determines geopolitical influence, when military capabilities depend on industrial capacity. A weakened Germany means a weakened Europe. A weakened Europe means a more dangerous world. Regional powers become more aggressive when traditional powers decline. Authoritarian regimes expand when democratic alternatives weaken. The stakes are much higher than German living standards or European integration. They're about global stability in an era of great power competition. This winter, as energy bills soar and factories close, millions of Europeans will experience the consequences of decades of policy failures. They'll understand, perhaps for the first time, what it means when ideology replaces pragmatism in economic policy. The question is whether that understanding will lead to necessary changes or accelerate political radicalization. History suggests both are possible. Economic crisis can produce reform or revolution, rational adjustment or irrational extremism, democratic renewal or authoritarian temptation. The parallels to other historical moments are troubling. Weimar Germany faced similar economic pressures in the 1920s and early 1930s. Political paralysis, industrial decline, social fragmentation, and extremist parties gaining support by promising simple solutions to complex problems. We know how that story ended. Modern Germany has stronger democratic institutions and deeper European integration, but economic stress tests political systems in ways that constitutional provisions cannot prevent. When people face declining living standards and uncertain futures, they become receptive to radical alternatives. The established parties seem oblivious to this dynamic. They continue offering technocratic solutions that address symptoms while ignoring causes. More EU integration, more climate regulations, more social programs funded by a shrinking productive economy. These responses might work if Germany faced temporary difficulties that could be managed through better policy coordination. But Germany faces structural challenges that require fundamental changes in energy policy, demographic policy, and economic strategy. Changes that the current political system cannot deliver because they conflict with ideological commitments that define the ruling coalition's identity. Germany's choices this winter will determine not just its own future, but Europe's trajectory for decades to come. The outcome is far from certain, but the warning signs are unmistakable. Europe's strongest economy is collapsing while nobody's talking about it. And when people finally notice, it may be too late to prevent the political consequences. Now you know why